Hey, what is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. I really hope you're having a fantastic day out there. And I also hope you're excited for the next couple of lessons that are upcoming on this channel. And I guess the question here is, what exactly are we going to be learning in the next couple of videos, right? Well, we are going to be working on this application all the way on the left side of your screen. And you'll kind of notice that it's a very standard chat messaging screen that is a list of a ton of these messages inside of a vertical UI table view, right? And so the most important feature of this application that I want to show you how to build out is the way we draw out each one of these chat bubbles right over here on the left side and also on the right side over here. And so the important thing to notice here is that all of these chat bubbles, they match the size of the text pretty much perfectly inside of each one of these bubbles over here. So you'll notice that for a very, very long message, this chat bubble is actually rather large. And so this technique here is actually commonly referred to as auto sizing or dynamic sizing of your cells inside of a table view or a collection view. And because there seems to be so many different ways of doing this on the internet, I wanted to show you a very simple technique to get all this going by just using a couple of constraints. Now, moving on here, this application contains a couple of different features. For example, depending on whether or not these messages are incoming or outgoing, the background color of these chat bubbles actually change from white to green, and we apply some similar logic to place it on the left side and also the right side of your app. And so finally, the last feature that we're going to be working on in this mini series is the ability to kind of group our messages together based on the date in which the message was sent out. So you'll notice that the top section here, all of these messages were sent out on August 25th. And if you scroll down a little bit, we have messages that belong on August 26th. And then we have one message for August 27th. And then the last section of messages, all of these guys belong to the 3rd of September. So you'll see a lot of messages for this particular date. So as you can kind of see by this very quick demo, there's a lot of features to actually build out, right? So instead of building out everything in one lesson, I'm going to focus on just teaching you how to build out the dynamic cell sizing feature of our application. And we're going to get started by jumping into Xcode right now. Alrighty, everybody, welcome back to Xcode and welcome back to our lesson. Now, the first thing we want to do is to create a brand new single view application, which is this right over here. And why don't we try to start off by running this application inside of the simulator on the right side. And we have our white screen, which is a pretty good place for us to start. Everything seems to be working. So why don't we go ahead and look at our application one more time right over here. And you'll notice that we have a vertical list view that contains a lot of these rows right here, right? Well, the easiest way to kind of get a vertical list view inside of an iOS application is to use a UITableView controller. So why don't we go ahead and open up View Controller, and we'll change this to be a UITableView controller instead. And you can try to run this app, but I believe it will crash. And so let's kind of see the crash first. And there we go. We have a nasty crash error right here. And the reason why it's crashing is because the way you set up a new single view app, it actually creates this storyboard file, which I don't really like using. So I'm going to bypass this storyboard by actually going inside of our app delegate right over here. And let's hit the stop. And we're going to create our own window inside of this method called did finish launching with options. So this is how you actually bypass the storyboard, by just creating your window manually like that. And in order to actually see this window inside of your application, you have to make it visible, so make key invisible. And finally, for your window, you have to specify the root view controller for it. Okay, so let me just type out some more code. I actually want a navigation bar kind of like that on the top. So I will use a UI navigation controller. And for the root of my navigation controller, I'll actually use my view controller class over here. So view controller, and let's just pop that in there. And let's create one and try to run this now inside of our simulator on the right side of the screen. And you'll see that we have our table view controller over here, and also a very nice navigation bar in the gray up at the very top. Okay, so that's kind of how you start off by creating a table view controller. If you want to change the top to actually have some kind of title, you can say title and type in messages like that. If you want to change the navigation controller to actually show a very, very large title, you can say prefer large titles equals to true. And once you run that, you'll have this very large title on the top left of your view controller like that. Okay, so that's pretty good. And I think that's a nice start for us today. The next thing we want to do is to start introducing some rows for our table view over here. And so the way you do that is to override this method called number of rows in section right over here. And I'm just going to return some kind of value of 10. This is totally arbitrary for now. And the other thing that you have to override is the actual cell for each one of these 10 rows that you've specified right over here. So this is a cell, that's a cell, and that's also a cell. Why don't I go ahead and create a dummy cell by saying let cell equals table view.dequeue, some kind of cell with an index path. And so this identifier over here, I'll just create it using a raw string. The index path will come from that over here. And then finally, you can just return this cell like so. And you can try to run this application right now, but I can tell you right off the bat that it should crash because we are experiencing this right here, this crash due to the dequeuing process. If you look at the crash over here, it tells you to actually register a cell with this ID. So we're just going to do that really quickly over here, table view, register class, and for this you can just register any type of class. So I'm going to use a UITableView cell, and we're going to use ID right over here and over here. And so once you do that, you can actually get this to work. So I'm going to modify the text label here to text equals something like test, test, test. And so what we've done over here is to create 10 cells, and each one of the cells will say test, test, test like that. All right, so one fix that you can actually apply to your code right now is you might want to abstract this string outside as a variable instead. So let cell ID equals ID. And if you want to make this private, you can do that as well. That's always a good idea for your application. So let's pop that in here and also over here. That way, if you modify this to be whatever you want, the application should still work and compile correctly. And there we go. Okay, so that's how we start off with our application. And what I want to kind of show you how to do right now is to provide this thing called auto sizing or dynamic sizing for each one of these cells right now. And the easiest way to actually do this is to provide some strings that are rather long for each one of our rows right now. So what I mean is, instead of saying test, 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 we want to provide a longer string that is actually going to wrap onto the next line and maybe even a third line. Okay, so that's going to be really long. And you'll notice that when I run this app, each one of these rows should be cut off on the right side over there. And what you can do now is you can actually change the text label to have something called number of lines. So cell dot, text label dot number of lines. And if you set that equal to 0, it's automatically going to push the text down a little bit further like that. And you'll see that with the text label that belongs to your default cell, the sizing of all of the text in all these rows are automatically sized for you. So that's the advantage of using this text label over here. However, the problem is that you don't really want to use this text label in the majority of situations. And typically what happens is you want to provide a custom cell that has its own label like that on the left side or the right side. And this custom cell should also contain this background for the chat bubble in the white and in the green like so, right? So why don't we go ahead and try to actually provide a custom cell that contains a label, and we'll try to look at how we can provide the dynamic sizing for that particular custom cell. Okay, so what I mean is we want to create a new file for our custom cell. So let's create a Cocoa Touch class. Make sure to subclass a UITableView cell, and this guy we'll just call it chat message cell, and just hit next, and just create it somewhere inside of your folder directory on the left side. And I don't really care about all of this stuff inside of the default template. And the one thing that I do care about is to create some kind of label. So I'm going to call this a message label. So let's make sure to create that with proper camel case, and let's create a label like that. Okay, so that's pretty good. And the question now is, what exactly do I want to do with this label? Well, this label is going to represent each one of these text messages right over here. And in order to see this label, we actually have to add it inside of our cell somehow. And so the easiest way of adding this message label into our cell is to override the initializer of style and reuse identifier over there. And you just want to say super and init with the style and also the reuse identifier over here. If you leave your code like this, you'll get this error message that you want to fix by just clicking that fix button. And everything should be good to go. The next thing you want to do is to add the subview of this message label into our cell somehow. So pop that in there. And then finally, you want to be able to see this label, right? So I'm just going to set a frame on this for now, just to kind of get things going. I'm going to say 100 and let's see, 100. And why don't I say message label dot background color equals something like dot green. Okay, so what I've done just now is to create this custom cell instead of a separate file, right? And I want to actually use this chat message cell instead of these default table view cells inside of my view controller right over here. And the way to do that is to just click over here. When you're trying to register these cells for your table view, you just want to use the chat message cell instead. And let's try to run this now. And I don't think we'll be actually seeing this message cell. Well, we're seeing the green message label on the left side, right? And that is this message label over here, background color of green. And you can start to set the text on this guy as well. So some message over here, and you can try to run that, and you'll see that the actual green will contain some of this text on the left side. So some message, and it gets truncated with the ellipses on the right. Okay, so that's pretty good. And this means that we're seeing this message cell inside of our application now. And so what I want to do is I want to remove this text on the right side. In other words, I just want to comment that out and just run this code one more time. And you'll kind of see just the green and the some message over here. Okay, so that's kind of where we are at this point of our application. And the next thing we want to do. All right, so the way that our application looks right now is pretty ugly, right? We have these message labels that are really tall and they actually exceed the bounds of our cell. And I guess the reason why it's doing that is because the frame that we're setting has a width of 100 and a height of 100. And if you've been programming with iOS for a while, you'll notice that we really should never use these frame objects like this. And instead, we should be using auto layout with constraints, right? And so the way that we actually set up this label inside of our cell is to actually use constraint in code. And so let's set up some constraints for our label here. And the way that you would do that is to say message label, and you can say top anchor. And we're just going to constrain these labels over here to match the bounds of our cell. So the top, the left, the right, and also the bottom. And so this is actually referred to as the leading and trailing anchor on the left and right side. So I'm going to show you how to do that by saying top anchor. And I'm going to constrain this to something. So let me say constraint equal to. And so this guy, I'm going to use the cell's top anchor. So you can either say self.top anchor or just top anchor like that. And so I'm going to do this 3 more times with the message label leading, like so. This bottom one, I'll say bottom anchor. This guy right here will be the trailing anchor. Okay, so I'm going to use the leading anchor right over here, the bottom anchor is the bottom and the trailing is the trailing like so. All right, so the last thing you have to do is you want to activate all these anchors. So there's a couple of ways of doing this, and one of the easier ways is to use an array like this, like that, and then you can end your array like so. Now this array, you can say let constraints equals all that, and then you can say ns layout constraint and activate some kind of array, and this guy will just say constraints like that. All right, so let me try to run this application now. And I think I'm missing one line of code to actually get this working. And so what you'll see is down here, you get this warning. And it's pretty much telling us that the message label over here, in order to make use of these constraints, you actually have to set this property called translates auto resizing mask into constraints. You just have to set that to false, and everything should start working automatically inside of our cell. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. And instead of using this very short message, that's this piece of string right there, let's pull in the longer string, which is this. So let me just copy that, go back to our cell, and let's just paste that in there and run one more time. Now, if you run your application one more time with this much longer string, you'll see that each one of your rows actually does contain this bit of text, but it's being truncated all the way on the right side over here with these 3 ellipses dots. And what we're going to do now is to provide the similar fix that we did earlier by giving this a number of lines equal to 0. And what that is going to do is it's going to actually make a word wrap like so. All right, pretty cool stuff. And the next thing we actually want to do is to fix the width of all of these text messages to be a lot thinner than the complete width of our view. I guess in other words, what I mean is we actually want our chat bubbles to be a lot smaller like this, right? And the easiest way of doing that is to give the anchors over here a little bit of a change. And so what's happening right now is that we're constraining this message label to the leading right here and also to the trailing. And what I would like to do is I don't want to use the trailing anchor, and instead of this, I'll use a width anchor. And I'll constrain it to some kind of constant value of, let's say, 250. And let me just run this and you'll see exactly what that does. Each one of these message labels now have a constant width of 250 instead of trailing all the way on the right side over there. Okay, so that's pretty good. And if you remove the green color, you can kind of just see the text messages only per row of your TableView controller. And that's what it looks like. And let's fix something else. For example, the spacing for all of these chat message bubbles, they have some padding on the left, top, and bottom, right? So you'll see some spacing that gives your application a little bit of breathing room. And the easiest way of doing that is to modify your anchors again. And for each one of these constraint calls, you can provide a constant like this. And I'll use a value of 32 for now. And so I might want to do that for the leading and also the bottom. You want to make sure for the bottom and the trailing anchors, you use a value of negative for the constant. And what that'll do is it'll kind of push it to give it some space on the left, top, and also the bottom right there. Okay, so that's kind of how you provide auto spacing for labels that kind of look like that. And why don't we start to introduce some variation for the amount of text inside of each one of these rows. So what I mean is, why don't we change this up by going back to the view controller and let's create an array. Let's say text messages equals some kind of array of strings. So here's my very first message. So that's going to be very short. And let's see, I'm going to message another long message that will word wrap. And there we go. And why don't I copy this a couple of more times in here. And let's just copy that and paste that in there. So that's a much longer message, and one more time. Okay, so with this text messages array, what I can do is, instead of using number of rows in section returning a value of 10, why don't we return text messages.count instead? And then all the way on the bottom over here, we can actually comment that out and say it's the cell.message label. So you can try to do this, but you can kind of see that it doesn't work, right? And the reason why that doesn't autocomplete correctly is because for this cell right here, you want to specify some casting of chat message cell like that. So chat message cell. And why don't we get some extra lines down here? So chat message cell. And once you do that, you can access this message label and say text equals to something. And this something on the right side is going to come from this array. So text messages. Let me just pop that in here and say index path dot row. I think that should be enough for us to kind of run our application. And each one of our rows will look like this. So very short, a little bit longer, 3 lines, and then much longer with this bit of text here. Okay, the next thing I would probably want to do is to kind of remove these horizontal separator lines for our table view controller. You can kind of see there aren't any vertical or horizontal lines in this finished app. The way you probably want to do that is to go inside of View to load for your table view controller. You can specify table view.separator style equals single line or line etched, but we'll just use none for now. And upon running that, you'll see that the horizontal lines will go away. So that looks pretty good. And the last thing we want to do is to provide the outer bubble for each one of these text messages, right? And this is actually pretty easy if we just create another view that represents the background. Let's go ahead and do that by going into chat message cell, and right above inside of here, let's call let background view equals some kind of view like that. And what I'm going to do is inside of the initializer, I'm going to set the background view right here. And let's call this background view background color equals some kind of color. I'm going to use yellow for now. And what I'm going to do is, I think I actually have to modify this. So let's call this bubble background view. That sounds like a pretty good name. And let's modify that as well. The reason why you can't call it background view is because the cell already has a property called background view. So we'll just give it a custom one like that. And now that I have my background view, I actually want to introduce it right behind all of these message labels. So the way that you would do that is to just add it right above this line. So let's say add subview, and we'll say bubble background view. And then the final thing that you have to specify are the actual anchors for this bubble background view. And so you have to specify it so that it kind of wraps around the text. And let me show you what those anchors need to be. And before I do the anchors, I want to specify translates auto sizing mask into false like so. And then finally, I want to provide this guy with some anchors. And you gotta make sure that you provide them down here somewhere. I guess more specifically, you want to do it after you add the subview of message label. Okay, so I'm going to say something else inside of this array. So let's say comma, and let's introduce some new anchors or constraints inside of this guy. And I'm going to say bubble background view. I'm going to specify the top anchor to actually constrain to the top of this guy. So what I mean is I'm going to say top anchor is going to be the message label. So constrained equal to the message label dot top anchor. And this guy, I think I want to provide a constant as well. So if I just say 0 for now, you'll kind of see what that does. So let me just paste this and paste that. And I want to say leading right there. And for this, I'll change this to bottom. And why don't I say trailing as well? So leading, I'll just modify that to be leading. Bottom, message labels, bottom, trailing, message label, trailing. And essentially what this is going to do is it's going to wrap itself all around the text message. And I think that's probably all I want to do for now. And so let me just run this, and hopefully I'll see a yellow background view for each one of our text labels. And that's exactly what we get, right? So we have that, that, and that. And the last thing I would like to do for our chat messages is to actually provide some spacing for the chat bubble. So you'll see some left, top, right, and bottom spacing, right? And that's actually pretty easy to do if you just give it some constant changes. So for the background bubble view, you want to modify this to be -16 and the leading is -16. So -16 will kind of bump it up, and negative left or -16 for the leading will bump it to the left. And then for the bottom and the right, you want to use +16. So it might be a little tricky, but that is just what you have to do for your background view. And once you do that, you'll kind of see this over here. So it kind of wraps itself all around the text message, but with 16 padding on all edges. And the last thing you have to do to kind of see the chat message bubbles individually like this is to make sure that the actual, let's see, the constant for the message label, instead of using 16 for the actual padding on the top, which is what this and this is, you can give it something larger like 32. So let's modify that to be 32. And that'll push it a lot further into the cell. And that's kind of what you get over here. One last thing that you might want to do is to provide some corner radius for the bubble view. So let's say bubble background view dot layer dot corner radius equals something like 5. I think I have that as my demo value. And let's just see what that does inside of our application. And that looks okay. Maybe I can further maximize this a little bit. And that's kind of what our rounded edges look like. All right, everybody, that's going to wrap it up for today's lesson. In the very next episode, we're going to take a look at how we can provide different chat message bubbles depending on whether or not a message is incoming or outgoing, kind of like this over here in the white and also in the green. Now, if you're interested in learning more about Swift development, you can check out the couple of courses using the links down in the description below. If you want to download all the source code for today's video, you can find the link down there as well. That's going to be it for me today. I'll see everyone in the very next lesson. Bye-bye, guys.